Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Yule record, Softscars. Singapore-born artist Yeule is, without a single conflicting thought crossing my mind even once, one of the most artistically enigmatic experimental pop musicians out there at the moment. And I don't just mean that in terms of their public persona. In fact, the public persona that they take up is probably the least complicated part of their artistic identity. Rather, I'm more so referring to where they came from in the first place, as well as what their place is in the current musical landscape. I mean, look, I'm not trying to hate on Singapore or anything like that, but it's also not necessarily a country that's known for its international musical output. It's not a country that produces a lot of really huge artists within any circles, really. So for the fact that Yule just kind of randomly popped up with a string of highly underrated EPs in the 2010s, coming onto a lot of people's radar before releasing their first full-length LP, Serotonin 2, in 2019, it was a pretty interesting and somewhat surprising thing to experience. Those releases solidified them as one of the most unique experimentalists of their kind, and 2022's Glitch Princess, a record that I was disgustingly late to the party on, I even had the chance to review it on this channel and just never did for whatever unfortunate reason, was a record that really confirmed that status. It just furthered that Yule was someone that you needed to have an eye on if you even remotely cared about contemporary experimental music. Softscars seems to aim to continue that hot streak of extremely interesting, emotional, and glitchy pop music. And you know what? Yule is far enough in their career at this point that I would expect a dud by now, but alas, Softscars, not a dud by any means, even if it is admittedly a not perfect record. I would actually say that the most immediately interesting thing about listening to this record is how sonically different it feels from other Yule releases up to this point. I think that there are a lot of qualities that carry over from past releases from Yule onto this record, which is something I'll touch on in a moment. But generally speaking, in terms of atmosphere, this one feels pretty unique. Whereas records like Glitch Princess, behind all of the walls of electronic experimentation, felt somewhat haunted in nature, a lot of the material found on Softscars is a bit more light, airy, even kind of heavenly at some points in terms of just how laid back yet still deeply emotional much of it is. And part of that can be attributed to Yule's vocal work, which is, I would say, light yet again deeply emotive, coming from a very personal place, and with their vocal work combining with these, again, very light and airy, heavily futuristic electronic instrumentals, it makes for something that feels pretty distinct in their discography. Despite the fact that I would not call this a comfort album or anything like that based on lyrical content alone, a lot of the instrumentals and the general vibe of the record is sort of comforting in a weird way. It's very soft and just sort of cloud-like overall, which is not necessarily something I would feel super comfortable with saying about any other Yule effort up to this point. I mean, really, in the few moments where this record dares to get a little more abrasive, it doesn't necessarily become abrasive. If anything, this record just takes certain tracks here or there to the very brink of noise pop without ever really crossing that bridge and just going over that threshold. For example, you have a track like Inferno that has these punchy synths and synth riffs put against these swirling backdrops that are semi-ambient in nature and really do make up a very soundscape-esque quality that would, again, be very much sound art if you stripped away some of the other musical elements here. And as a whole, I do think that this could have potentially meant that Softscars felt creatively suppressed in some way, if not for the fact that this creative difference from past Yule records feels very genuine and extremely well executed. Really, this record doesn't feel like it's trying to be softer for appealing to a certain crowd or trying to be softer for the sake of just being more gentle. You'll obviously know what they're doing here, their creative direction is extremely strong, and their more delicate approach to sounds they've experimented with in the past, as well as some newer elements, it ultimately makes for something really interesting to hear from them. their production efforts on this record that I would definitely say provide a lot of that success. I'm not necessarily saying that the creative direction is weak. Again, very strong, and it's obvious that Yule knew what they were doing going into this record, but I really do think the production in particular feels very spacious and gives both the album and the performances found within it the sort of room to really just come alive and find their own space in the constantly changing vibe and tone that this record takes up. With all of that being said, a lot of Softscars does recycle elements from past Yule records that results in an album and listening experience that, for people who have listened to their past efforts, feels uniquely theirs. For example, the songwriting here, which is excellent, might I add, is heavily based around themes of isolation, self-loathing, and a bunch of other emotions that are never particularly fun to feel. But then again, those ideas are reinvented here. They aren't just repeats or retreads of past ideas from the Yule discography. For example, Yule themselves stated that this record's take on those concepts was more heavily based around the idea of sort of an AI gaining human sentience and having to deal with the struggles of navigating life and existence, and that is how a lot of the themes of existentialism are brought up through this record in a very natural yet robotic manner and cadence. I mean, this isn't a concept album by any means. In fact, it's not even a slightly narrative record. That was really just sort of a comparison slash metaphor for what this album feels like from Yule, but at the same time, it's pretty damn accurate. I mean, the general concept of suffering and this desperation to find some semblance of purpose, it's something that's pretty omnipresent throughout the entirety of the record, just sort of this ever-looming shadow, except it's directly intertwined with the content of the album itself. It's certainly not just a subtle influence or anything like that, and it's pulled off really well. You have tracks like Software Update and For You I Want To, and I think that these are songs that really highlight this dangerous tightrope walk that Yule is doing between trying to find some sense of hope within the bleakness of life and just succumbing to the misery of existence. I wouldn't really say that one or the other are even remotely achieved throughout the entirety of this record, but it does make for a very interesting record from a lyrical perspective. It's an album that hates itself and maybe hates you slightly as well, and it also loves itself and also kind of loves you too. It's a very, very polarizing record intentionally, and because of that, I have nothing but respect for that. And again, some of the more subtle qualities of the record are further benefited from, as I stated before, Yule's subdued yet striking vocal performances throughout the entirety of the tracklist. And overall, all I have to say is that Softscars is a notable example of a record that is successful as an artist tries to take older sounds and reinvent them in some new way, while still making sure that they feel rooted in the classic sounds, but at the same time they don't feel recycled. It's a vicious cycle, I know, but hey, it works here, so. I mean, yeah, there's just a lot of ideas here that are taken from previous Yule records to varying extents, but at the same time, they never let those ideas make the album feel weaker or redundant because of them. It just incorporates them in a new creative direction, and one that, again, in my eyes, works out pretty well in the end. Even still, Softscars is not a perfected version of Yule's sound or style by any means. In fact, I would actually call it a very imperfect record, even though I do genuinely enjoy it. For example, despite the fact that between singles and general hype in the period leading up to the release of this record, there were sort of hints at a more indie rock-based sound for this album, that's honestly only found on a couple of songs here or there, like, say, Cyber Me and Sulky Baby. And while those songs are very, very strong, great even, I don't necessarily think it's as consistent as it could have, and maybe should have been. When Yule do allow these sounds to flourish, it really does feel like something incredibly interesting is happening, and I think that the moments where they really do lean into these more indie tendencies, that it results in a listening experience maybe a bit more distinct and maybe a bit more intriguing than some of the more electronic-based instrumentals here. I mean, obviously the more rock-oriented tracks still have electronic instrumentals to them, but nonetheless, it feels like a completely different spin on what we've seen from Yule in the past, and I do kind of wish that they would have gone a little bit further with this particular niche of the many creative decisions that they're making throughout this record. because ultimately I feel that it causes the album to be a bit inconsistent tonally. I mean, obviously, as I stated before, all of the songs here have a sort of universal theme throughout them in one way or another, but at the same time, in terms of just influences alone, I hear a couple of songs here or there, and I wish that the rest of the album sounded maybe a little bit more like that, just with slight variations being presented upon those ideas. And as it stands, it's just a couple of songs that have a couple of different influences from the rest of the track list, and then just more of the glitchy electronic pop kind of style. And that's not bad. That's a good thing. But nonetheless, it makes for an album I'm slightly disappointed in, even if I still do like the record a lot. There's also just a couple of generally weaker tracks on this record, particularly the sort of ambient transitional piece, Fish in the Pool. I don't really think it's necessary at all. I mean, yes, it is meant to be this sort of transitional moment on Softscars, and I get the intent, but at the same time, the flow between different tracks here that don't have ambient pieces shoved between them is so strong and so consistent already that I feel like a 2.5 minute impressionistic piece wasn't really required, and I suppose I would have no issue with it if it were really well done, but just in the context of this record, it's a fine instrumental that really does absolutely destroy the momentum for a very brief period of time. Not long enough to ruin the back half of the record or anything like that, but enough that you notice it. You could also argue that the album ends a bit awkwardly with the track Aphex Twin Flame, which is an absolutely amazing song title for a track that is just fine, really. It's this sort of acoustic singer-songwriter style track, and I do enjoy it, and I think it stands on its own as a decent song, but it really doesn't have a hugely powerful build-up, and the climax of the song doesn't really feel that particularly striking either, especially compared to some of the more climactic moments on other songs on this record. And having it close out the album, it just really doesn't feel like it fits, especially considering the skeletal nature of both the song's structure and the song's performance feel very much parallel to the ethereal lushness of a lot of the rest of the track list. And hey, these aren't flaws that cause this album to just like fold in on itself or anything like that, but at the same time, Softscars does feel weaker and generally less artistically successful because of it. I'm not saying that this album's a total failure, it's just that I think that it could have reached its full potential had it just been maybe a little more polished in a few different ways. Yeule is still one of the most exciting artists in current experimental pop music. I mean, their ability to weave together non-traditional song styles and genres with somewhat traditional song structures and creating atmospheres all at the same time with excellent production is still wildly impressive on the best moments of this record, and excluding Fish in the Pool, the weaker tracks on this album would honestly probably be album highlights from a lesser artist that I wouldn't as much expect anything from. The distance that Yeule keeps away from the listener emotionally really does add to that feeling of isolation for them as this sort of narrator figure throughout the entirety of the record, yet at the same time, it's so obvious how personal and deeply emotional of an album that Softscars can be for them from time to time. Look, if Softscars was meant to be some sort of transcendental, futuristic, forward-thinking, experimental pop album, you could argue that it doesn't necessarily hit the mark all the way, but at the same time, this is still a strong record, a lot of great tracks on it, and again, even its weaker moments are merely mediocre and just small issues above all else that sort of add up into just one bigger, singular issue. As it stands, Yeule's latest effort remains a strong one, even with its blemishes. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.